Dave Kajganich, you wrote the screenplay for the coming-of-age cannibal love story Bones and All, based on the novel by Camille DeAngelis. So first off, what did you think about that book when you first read it?
Well, it really caught me off guard. It was submitted to me by a producer I'd never met who had said, "I really thought of you when I read this book." And so it's always very interesting to see how people pair you up with stories. And when I started reading it, I was really surprised to learn that what I had been considered the right fit for was this cannibal love story, but also a coming of age story of a young woman. And I had a blast reading the book because it is such a wild blend of genres, and it's just very astute about, in a very kind of fresh and open-hearted way about, what it means to be sort of, an other in some respect, how you're treated, what's expected of you, what you end up expecting of yourself, how you fight back from being marginalized. There was a lot that interested me about the book. And I had some kind of foundational conversations with the author of the novel, Camille, and the producer to make sure that I really was the best fit for it. Because even though this novel is about cannibals kind of on the road and in love, it did feel like a personal book to me. So I just wanted to make sure the author was not just permissive of my doing it or a man doing it, but excited about what I could bring to it. And so those conversations were lovely. And then I was off and running.
And one of the interesting things about the story, in the film, is how it's balancing so many different kinds of tones. It's got the really dark elements, but it also has some kind of macabre humor to it. And of course, there's the romance at the heart of it. How difficult is that to balance in a script when you have all of those different kind of elements?
Well, of course, it's a challenge. And when I work with Luca Guadagnino, it's the third time I've written a project for him. It's always this nest of different tones, sometimes competing tones. And, what I love about that, it allows you to tell your story through a number of different grammars. I mean, there's a horror grammar in this film. Obviously, there's a romance, sort of a young romance grammar. There's a road movie grammar. And all of these grammars sort of have different rules of how to use the image and how to use pacing or how to use anxiety, tension, things like that. And I just get a lot out of the intellectual challenge and the emotional challenge of fitting them together so that scenes are playing on different fields at the same time. In this film, you might start a scene in the love story grammar and end the scene in the horror grammar, or the reverse, or you might, sort of mix them into some strange new tone. There are a couple of moments in this film that really, I'm not sure I could even describe how they make me feel. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, I feel really grateful to be working on projects that are complicated like this one was.
And you've worked in the horror genre before, as you mentioned. Is it a particular genre that you're drawn to, or is it just sort of something that's happened where the projects that have come your way have been?
Well, I grew up in the 80s, the advent of like bad cable television. So I watched a lot of horror movies growing up, and I loved them because they were cathartic, obviously, and they sort of over amplify emotion in an interesting way. And when I grew up sort of a teenager in rural Ohio. I was gay. I was in the closet. I was sort of worried about how I was going to fit into the world. Seeing those kinds of anxieties, or any kind of sort of anxiety amplified, is really gratifying, and it's really cathartic. And so I think when I started my career, I necessarily sort of gravitated to horror because I felt like I had learned so much from kind of emotionally about myself and about the world from watching horror movies. So it was only natural to sort of want to try to pick that up as a genre to write in.
And you mentioned the different sort of grammars of different genres. Besides obviously the book, were there other kind of films or shows or references that you were inspired by when telling this particular story?
Well, I looked at a lot of road movies because I knew that grammar is particularly difficult. I mean, writing a road story that really feels like a road trip feels is difficult because those actual journeys are full of sort of red herrings and dead ends and redundancy and periods of torpor and boredom. And in order to have something on the screen feel like an actual road film, you have to have those ingredients in it as well, which are risky if you're trying to tell, a sort of an efficient, brisk story. So that was one thing I wanted to school myself in quite a lot before I started writing the film, was to get the pace of a tone, the tone poem that a road trip really is, without a structure that's necessarily reassuring.
And yeah, as you mentioned, you've worked a few times with Luca Guadagnino, and working with him again on this film. What is that collaboration like? Because the films you've worked on with him are incredibly different from each other, like A Bigger Splash, Suspiria, and now this. What's that experience like?
I feel like our relationship a bit is like kids at a slumber party, sort of daring one another to do weird things. Every time we talk about what we might do next, it always just gets stranger and more interesting or more unexpected. So when he calls, I'm always prepared for to be invited to think about some crazy thing that I would never have sort of suggested for myself. But I do the same to him when I turn in these scripts. I put things in there that I really think are going to be interesting and difficult to direct, just to see what he does with them. And we just have a lot of fun with each other, sort of poking one another and daring one another to do weird new things.
And one of the most interesting standout characters in the film is Sully, played by Mark Rylance. And there's a character who's at the intersection of a lot of these different tones in the film, the horrific and the comedic and the sinister and all of that. Was that character especially difficult to write, or was it maybe the most fun character to write? Like, how do you approach a character that out
well,
there?
I wouldn't say he was the most fun to write, because I find him so disturbing and also violent, and not, I don't mean in a literal way, although he is violent in a literal way. I mean, he is so disorganized in terms of a personality and a way of relating to the world. It was really, there's a lot of pathos to that character, because he has gone so long in his life without substantial human relationships. He doesn't even know what they are anymore. He doesn't know how to have them. He doesn't know how to form them, how to maintain them. And so when he bonds early in the film with the protagonist of the film, Marin, he doesn't know if he wants to be her father or her lover or her friend. And it's so confused in his mind that every scene just sort of escalates this disorganization. And I just found it really upsetting to write that character. And Mark on set would not step out of character. So he spoke in that accent and with that nervous system all the time, like craft services, standing in line for the restroom. He was always Sully, which made it even more upsetting, but a lot of fun. His performance is extraordinary.
And there's so many different characters who make appearances in the film. Being a road film, you have characters who come in for like a scene or two and make a really strong impression. How do you sort of encapsulate a character and give them this kind of full life in a brief time?
I think you can't write those scenes for the audience. I think you have to forget that the audience is even there, in the sense that I try to take a really naturalistic approach and not have lines of dialogue coming out of characters' mouths that are meant to educate an audience. And what that means, if you stop doing that, then the naturalistic dialogue can take its place and be full of details, half details, strange amalgams of references that you don't understand, things like that make a person on screen feel like a person that you're not being invited to know, but you're being, or understand, but you're being invited to observe. And I think once you think of it that way, you can really build quite a lot of specificity into characters, knowing that the audience will find them peculiar, maybe confusing in some respect. But this is how we feel about people that we overhear on the bus, do you know what I mean? Or sort of overhear in a movie theater. We don't know anything about them except the very few things we're being given. So as long as those few things are highly specific and seem sincere, I think that takes care of it.
Well, I want to congratulate you on your work on the film, and as people get to see it, look forward to what everyone thinks of this incredibly unique film. So thank you so much for talking to me about it.
Thank you very much.
Lena Dunham, you're the writer-director of Catherine Called Birdy, the 13th century coming-of-age story based on the 1994 novel by Karen Cushman. What was your relationship to the book before making the film?
Great question. So I read this book for the first time when I was 10 years old in 1996. So I was about 2 years late to the party, but still fairly early. And from the minute I read it, I mean, I was a child who was very transported by novels, particularly historical fiction, like many kids. And from the moment I read it, I felt I had a special connection to the main character. She was bratty, but loving. She could be brave, but childlike. She was a character who felt like she completely resonated on my frequency. And so the book stayed very close to me. And when I started making films, it was one of the first films that I dreamed about making. And so I got the rights in 2013 and ended up, shooting the film 8 years later in 2021. And it was a journey to get there and to get people to understand just why it was so important to me, but we did.
Growing up with this book, is your relationship with it now, going into making the film, was that different than when you were experiencing it as a 10-year-old?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the thing that was wonderful about the fact that I didn't get to make the movie when I was 23 was that as I grew, my empathy for the characters who, besides Birdie, grew. And so when I was young, it was like I completely associated myself with this lead who was struggling against the kind of morality of her time, struggling against the tropes of her day. And as I got older, I also started to feel empathy for everyone from, Morwenna, her babysitter, to her mother, who was dealing with the expectations around fertility, to her father, who was dealing with the kind of with his own masculinized version of these pressures. And growing up and into a world where I could understand these other characters certainly opened it all up for me in a new way.
And how different is the experience for you coming into adapting previous material as opposed to writing your own original screenplay?
Well, I think I chose this material because I felt such a deep reverence for it, which is wonderful, but can also make it challenging because you want to hold on to every aspect of the book that you love and you just can't. And so first I had to free myself from the idea that I was going to be able to keep every element of this novel alive and to recognize that I was going to have to make some very significant changes, and hoping that Karen, the author, would understand kind of the deep passion that I felt for her work, and that all these changes came from a desire to really hold on to the core spirit of what she'd made. But what I love about adapting, which is so different than writing stories that sort of come out of thin air, is I love that you can find ways to, through empathizing with these characters, hide bits of your own experience in these lives that are very different from your own. And I found that aspect of it incredible. And I also love the fact that when you do get lost or when you do get stuck, you have this roadmap of the book and what initially attracted you to the material.
Another thing that's different about this story, of course, is that it's set in 13th century England as opposed to your usual kind of contemporary American milieu. Like, how different was that as a writing experience?
I think the thing that was different about it was that what was joyfully different about it was the research that I got to do into this moment in history and what the day-to-day lives of people, particularly women, and the domestic life were like at this moment in history. And I loved being able to kind of luxuriate in the strange details of that time. And then there was also the element of this taking place almost 1,000 years ago, and certain aspects of it feeling incredibly timely. I mean, it was an unfortunate coincidence that, Roe was overturned just a month before the movie came out, and these issues of bodily autonomy and the bodily autonomy of, people with uteruses, the bodily autonomy of people who identify as women, this remains in some ways as charged an issue as it always did. And so I was very aware, even as I was depicting a time that felt very alien and far off in certain ways, that there were aspects of it that were unfortunately completely applicable to the current world.
There's also sort of like a hopefulness to that, in the sense that you're sort of going back almost 1,000 years, as you say, and finding this spirit in this character alive and well at the time. You're sort of going back in time to kind of find this modern feminist, empowering kind of figure.
Well, it's interesting because I think it's a bit of a misconception that we sometimes have that women and people who were marginalized just went along with that, as if that kind of those kind of historical pressures, that they buckled under those. And there have always been fighters, and there have always been people who have, and that's what keeps the world moving forward, is the people who recognize that the situation they find themselves in is essentially unjust. And so what I love about Birdy is that despite every element keeping her down, pushing her towards an arranged marriage, pushing her towards conforming to people's ideas of what a daughter and a wife should be at that point, she continues to buck against those trends, and she does it with humor, and she does it with style. And so that is, as you say, there's a hopefulness to that, and it's a wonderful character to get to embody as a writer.
And as you mentioned, feeling more empathy and connection to other characters in the stories as you've gotten older. And I think one of those characters where that comes out in is her father, Rollo, who's played by Andrew Scott, who at first could be just a complete kind of brutish, domineering person, but then you kind of get to know their own kind of struggles. Tell me about writing that character and casting Andrew Scott.
Well, I will say thank you for noticing that, because it's very much what Andrew and I were attempting to do. And Andrew had a huge impact on what that character became. In the novel, he is much more brutish. He has like a brief moment of redemption, but he really is this kind of like belching, farting, alcoholic disaster of a kind of overlord. And I think what Andrew and I talked about as I tried to coax him to do the film, because I'm just such a big fan and I knew he would do something wonderful with it, is we talked about this idea of what does it look like when history exerts its control on everyone. And it's not just women who suffer under patriarchy, and it's not just daughters. The same pressures the pressures he felt to provide for his family, to be the proper depiction of kind of a masculine leader, those would have those would be their own form of injustice. And what would it look like if we found the softer person underneath that, who really did love his child and really did love his wife, but was at a loss for how to engage and was afraid to push back. And so we talked a lot about that, and it really influenced this character and influenced the idea that he had a real sweetness and lightness to him, and a fear of stepping outside of the norm.
And being both a writer and director, is there one part of that process that you prefer? Do you consider yourself a writer at heart or a director at heart?
I think I will always consider myself a writer first. The reason I started directing was because I wanted to be able to protect my stories in a certain way, and I've come to love it. I love how directing is a continuation of the writing process. You get to color the world in through your work with your production designer, your work with your costume designer, and most especially through your dialogue with your actors. And then, of course, there's the incredible way that your use of the camera can change the way a scene registers. But for me, it all comes out of writing, and writing is when I feel safest. It's when I feel most creative, and it's when I feel most myself.
And you're nominated for a Gotham Award for your screenplay. What was that recognition like to get?
Well, I got about 5 missed calls from my manager. And he wrote, "Call me ASAP." I obviously thought something terrible had happened, because that's just my ingrained way of thinking from having grown up with a Jewish grandmother. So that was where my fear kicked in. And then, of course, when I got the call, it was incredibly special and meaningful. The Gothams were the first award that I was ever nominated for Tiny Furniture, which was a completely surreal experience where I actually did get to go with my mother and my Jewish grandmother, who is no longer with us. And so to go back there and be in that space again with this cast I love so much, and also to have had a long enough career to know that doesn't always happen, and to be recognized by your peers for something that's this meaningful. Of course, I tell people all the time that, young people, we don't do this for the awards and we don't do this for the recognition. If that's what you want, then definitely pick a different job. But when it does happen, it's a very special moment that should be savored. So I'm doing that.
Well, congratulations on that. Congratulations on the film in general. And thank you so much for talking with me about it.
It's a pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much.
Krysty Wilson-Cairns, you wrote the screenplay for The Good Nurse, about the woman who ends up stopping Charles Cullen, who was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, working as a nurse in hospitals. How did you first learn about Charles Cullen's story?
I was quite amazed that I had never heard of Charles Cullen, because I'm the kind of weirdo that like Googles serial killers at 3 a.m. And the first time it ever came to my attention was Charles Graeber's book, The Good Nurse, which 10 years ago was sent to me. It was an open assignment at the agency I just signed with. And I read the first chapter thinking I was going to pass because I didn't really want to do a serial killer story. And then I stayed up all night reading the book because it's incredibly written, but also the story was totally unbelievable to me, and I wanted to tell it.
And I know you had discussions with the real nurse, Amy, who was responsible for bringing this band down. What were those conversations like, and how did that influence your writing approach?
Well, the book itself, it takes place over Charles Cullen's whole life. So it spans particularly the 16 years that he was killing in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And I didn't ever want to tell the story from his point of view. I didn't really feel a way into that story at all. And then in the last third of the book, you read about Amy Lochran, who is the nurse that caught him. And as soon as I sort of read about her, I was like, a working class, single mum, she has health problems, she's trying to do everything right for the patients, and she shouldn't have to stop a serial killer, but it falls at her feet. And so I was really struck by this woman. I kind of couldn't believe she existed. I couldn't believe that we hadn't built a statue of her. And when I actually got to meet her, I was incredibly intimidated. I was 24 at the time. It was my first paid job. I was really young when I started out in the research of this. And I went up to upstate New York in like February. I stayed in a place that looked a lot like The Shining. I was totally out of my element. And I was so fortunate that she was so gracious and open and giving. And actually that collaboration with her spanned the entire decade, and even she was on set and helped with every aspect of the process. So she really gave us access to her story.
And how much research did you do beyond reading the book and talking to Amy Lochran?
Frankly, maybe a crazy amount. I love my research, and I think I went quite full on with this, and I was very fortunate. So I had full access to Charles Graeber's archives. So I had, the recordings, the confession, the recordings from the diner scene, the entire court recording. So I had all of that. I worked 2 weeks of night shifts at a hospital in Connecticut, shadowing nurses. I thought I would get to sort of stand back with a notebook, but they had none of that. And so I was changing bedpans. I was like, elbow deep, frankly. And then I spent a lot of time with the cops. And I spent a lot of time just familiarizing myself with the American healthcare system, because it's very different from the system that I operate in. And so, yes, like buckets of research, months of it.
And getting to know the American healthcare system, and I'm sorry you had to be put through that. Coming from a non-American point of view, because the American healthcare system is like the other serial killer in the film almost. What was that like to learn about, and what did you always want to include that element of it in the story, or did that come as you researched the system and found out how that sort of?
I mean, I found the thing that really drew me to this story, apart from Amy, was the fact that it was a movie about a serial killer where the serial killer wasn't the only villain. And also, usually in these stories, you get to sleep at night because the serial killer, the real villain, is behind bars. And for me, there was an element that another villain in the story still existed. And that was totally entwined with it. It wasn't something I ever tried to push on it. But it came down to the really important question for me: I never wanted to have the question be answered in the film, why did Charles Cullen kill people? Because that answer is unknowable. I would have to invent it, and that felt wrong to me. It felt wrong to Eddie and to Tobias and to the whole team. But what was really interesting to me was, how did he do it for so long? How did this go on for 16 years? How did this happen in 9 different hospitals? And to me, that question is only answered by the failings of the American healthcare system, which puts profits ahead of patients.
As you mentioned, there's no clear answer as to why he committed these murders. Does that make it harder to write the character, knowing that there's always this kind of unknowable aspect of him?
One of the choices we made really early on in the development process was to tell Amy's story and to tell it from her point of view. And I think there was briefly a time where we even talked about perhaps meeting the real Charles Cullen, but I knew that was never going to kind of yield anything specifically for the script, because it had to be from Amy's point of view. It had to be her understanding of Charlie. And the way she describes him is that he was her friend, that he saved her life, that he looked after her. And there was only 2 times that she saw the murderer. So she described him in this really didactic nature. And that, I think, allowed me, Eddie, Tobias, and Jessica to really frame how that story should feel, and to never let the audience get ahead of Amy's character, because I think that would rob her of like her dignity. And also you would be like, oh, of course. So we never wanted it to be a whodunit. We never wanted to anything salacious or anything like that. So yeah, we always drilled into her version of him, because that was the only truth that I had access to.
And the true crime genre in general, can be controversial at times. But this film, one of the things I appreciated about it is it works very hard at not being exploitive, and that a lot of that comes through telling it through Amy's point of view. How much were those considerations part of writing the script?
I mean, that was the DNA of the project. I think there's a responsibility especially when you're telling true stories, when you're adapting real people's lives, that you don't have the right to invent things, not in that way. And so for me, keeping it honest, keeping it truthful, I think was the inception of the idea. And when Tobias came on board, I was so fortunate that we were totally in lockstep with that. And he actually, we spent a lot of time, he was in Copenhagen, I was in London, like Skyping and talking about, was there any elements in the script where these rogue kind of horror ideas, was the hospital too dark at night? Did this feel a bit Silence of the Lambs? And just always stripping that out, because I love the horror genre and I spent a lot of time with it. Some of these things slip through the net. So we spent a lot of time just keeping it real, to not make it salacious. And also because we had to respect the memory. People died at this man's hand, and in these hospitals. And so it was so important to us to not, in any way tarnish those memories.
And Amy Loughlin has been, out and about promoting the film, been a big part of the press tour for the film. What has it been like seeing her get that moment in the spotlight? As you said, she deserves a statue, and now at least, she's getting this kind of moment in the spotlight.
I think, the only way I can really, I can frame it like this. I've spent 10 years working on this. I've always come back to it. It's been a story that I just really felt it just needed to be told. People needed to know that it happened and to know what this woman had done. And 10 years of a process kind of wears you down, and you think that's a long time to spend on something. And when we were at TIFF, it was the first time we'd seen it with an audience. And at the end of the screening, Tobias brought Amy on stage, and there was just this rapturous standing ovation. And Eddie and I were sitting next to each other, and we both were just absolutely in tears, because it was finally seeing this woman recognized. And I kind of remember thinking to myself, that's not a bad way to spend 10 years.
Well, congratulations on the film, which is on Netflix now, and it's a pleasure talking with you about it.
Thank you.
Julia Cho, you co-wrote the Pixar animated film Turning Red, about a girl who undergoes a unique kind of puberty where she periodically turns into a red panda. How did you come to be involved in the film?
Well, I was actually working at Pixar. I'd come to work on another film, and then I sort of transitioned off that and wasn't sure what I would do after that. But while I was there, I had seen this amazing short, Bow. I had seen it in the theater at Pixar, and I just remember just weeping afterwards. And I didn't know Domi then, but I remember accosting her in one of the little employee areas and being like, that movie. And I probably cried on her then too. And it was just the truthfulness of how much her work spoke to me. And then it just turned out that then when she needed a writer again for her project, that I was lucky enough to be invited to be part of that possibility. And I just was so excited to have the chance to work with her specifically. And so then we just started working together on this idea that she had. It had already progressed to a certain point, and it was already amazing with just this incredibly like vibrant relationship between this mother and daughter. So from that point forward, it was just a wonderful opportunity to collaborate with just the weird and wonderful and just brilliant mind of Domi.
And you've written, plays also in live action TV. How different is the experience writing for animation?
It is very different. At the same time, it feels like I didn't realize at the time that moving from genre to genre, I think I was developing a certain toolbox without really realizing it. And I think that it's not necessarily to the entire genre of animation, but I think something about the process of Pixar, the way they make movies, I felt like I was suddenly realizing, oh, I have these tools. Like I do know how to work with actors or, help with casting from theater and from TV. I do know how to work with a director collaboratively. I've been working with showrunners for years. So I felt like just bit by bit, it was also giving me new tools, but also giving me a way to just cohere all these things that I had been doing separately for so long. And so there was a real synthesis, I felt, of the work I had done previously in different genres and settings.
And as you mentioned, working with Domi Shi, who's also the director. What's like? As you mentioned, working with directors, you're used to that. What's that collaboration like? Writing the script with the director.
Well, with Domi, it was a lot of time just spent getting to know her. I remember early on, we would just have lunches. And when I first started, it was just the two of us. And so there was a kind of a luxury of just spending time, not even talking directly about the movie, but just about our experiences. I think sort of naturally, of course, we started with our own mother, daughter relationships. And then I also felt like I could bring to that the fact that I was a mom and also could see it from that angle as well. So we talked a lot about our moms, our families, and all of that was just happening around the time we actually spent in the room talking about this story and the plot and the mechanics of it. But the two things really spoke to each other. And I feel like, what was really lovely about that time, when I think about it in the beginning, it was just like paid dividends, because then even years later, like literally years later, we could be stuck on a story point and I could be like, remember that story about the time that, you had that fight, or I would bring up a story. And so it just created a bed of stories and memories and things that we could just refer back to, even when we were in like really technical territory about trying to fix a story point. So it's really a wonderful way to collaborate, because it was just a rich and very nuanced collaboration, because we were spending so much time together, and that we got to know each other in a fuller way than just if we had gone together just to work together, on a project.
On animation, does the writing and the animating sort of are they happening in tandem, or does the script need to be sort of locked in before that work gets done?
The script is never locked, it seems. I think that there was most of the process was not so much animation, because animation is sort of a later part of the pipeline. But early on, there was, after the first draft of the script, that was probably the only time that there was a discrete script writing time. After that, then it moves into a part of the production where there's a story team of incredible story artists who then board your script. So then the script is no longer just in script form. It starts to become a visual entity. And that becomes very fluid, because the script scenes are being handed off to these incredible artists who are then bringing their ideas and their creativity to it and coming up with things that you didn't anticipate. And then that's informing your next rewrite of the script. And so it kind of started flowing back and forth between script and story. And I felt after a while like an honorary member of the story department, like the only member who couldn't draw, but felt sort of adopted by them, like they're like little stray, like because I'm the only writer on the project, but I kind of exist as a team member, through story department was sort of how I felt about it.
One thing that I liked about this film, and that I'm seeing a lot in animation lately, is that it's a story with no real villains. It's entirely about relationships and how people, kind of reconcile those. What do you think about, how much, nuanced sophistication we're getting to see in these stories through animation?
That's a great point, because I too have sort of noticed this trend away from cardboard villains or just like people who are just bad for no reason. I think that it speaks to the ways in which like empathy has become so important in our culture, but also in our storytelling, and that you can't really get away, I think, with one-dimensional characters, good or bad. So I felt like, with Ming, we were always really careful with the mother character that she was definitely an obstruction to the main character and everything she wanted. But yeah, she couldn't be a villain because she's a mom, she loves her daughters. So I think that we always knew, okay, we don't have like your classic villain. But I think what I found interesting was that you still needed an antagonist. So I guess we're in this world of storytelling right now where there aren't really villains, but there are still formidable antagonists. And I think part of the fun of a character like Ming is that it's her love that makes her an antagonist. The kind of paradox of that was kind of a wonderful gift, because she could act so badly, but because you knew how much she loved her daughter, it wasn't exactly excusable, but it was understandable. And I think that to your question about like how that storytelling and, emerging in animation, I think, there's definitely complexity to animated stories as well. I think people point to the fact that, our culture, American culture, is not we think of it as stories for children, but there are other cultures in Asia or elsewhere that consider animation a storytelling genre for everyone. And so many of us adult, watchers of animation still, I think, have like an appreciation and love for Miyazaki films or for some of the Pixar films. So for me coming in, I never approached it like I was writing the story just for children. The way ideally I think of it is that, all of us have a part of ourselves that maybe is our truest part that has been there since childhood. Like we're born with it. That's who we are. And that part doesn't change however old we are. And in fact, I think that part of us maybe comes out clearest when we're children. So for us, ideally, it's let's tell a story for that person, that ageless person who's there from the beginning and is there no matter how old we get.
Another thing that's great with animation is that, it's almost like if you can see it, you can create it, or if you can imagine it, you can create it. Is that especially freeing to go into a script knowing that, was the sky the limit, or were there any limitations?
You would think that the sky is the limit, but I think animation is so funny because it overturns all of your assumptions about what is hard and what isn't hard. Because in animation, you're like in live action, you would be like, I need 1,000-foot red panda. Live action would be like, okay, that's going to be a big budget item, right? And then in animation, it was sort of like, can we have girls like touching their hair, like putting their hair, like the interface between hand and hair, very expensive, right? So it was just like, oh, like earrings are hard, like in animation, yes, very hard to do dangling things. Like so it's really funny because in many ways the sky was the limit in terms of imagination, like large kaiju battle, trashing all of Toronto. But then there were some like really simple things like every kid needs a backpack. Oh, every kid needs a backpack, because everything has to be built and made. So it just kind of was funny how it turned your idea of like, what is hard? What is, expensive or ambitious? And I think for us, what was ambitious was actually telling a middle school tale with all of the details of middle school life. Like that was, I think, the more ambitious part rather than the 1,000-foot tall red panda.
Well, congratulations on the film, and thank you so much for talking to me about it. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you.
Welcome to our Meet the Experts Film Writers panel. I'm Gold Derby editor Daniel Montgomery here with David Kajganich from Bones and All, Lena Dunham from Called Birdy, Krysty Wilson-Cairns from The Good Nurse, and Julia Cho from Turning Red. I've talked with you all individually about your films. They're all incredibly different from each other, but I think like pulling out a little bit like to the writing process in general, like what are your favorite parts of being a writer, and some of your least favorite parts of kind of the process of it? Let's start with Julia.
I was thinking how my favorite parts are my least favorite parts simultaneously. I feel like my favorite part is when I'm alone and I'm in my pajamas and it's 4 a.m. No one else is up and it's really quiet and I get to just like immerse myself in my imagination. And then I feel like conversely, those are also my least favorite moments when I'm alone, everyone else is asleep, and I have to come up with some, incredible idea on the spot. So I think it's both a great gift and sometimes also a great fear all at the same time.
Well, I think Julia, what she described about 4 a.m, immerse your own imagination, wearing your pajamas, it sounds extremely familiar to me. And I would say that it is like, I love the great, incredible highs that come with feeling like you get to enter another world, and the feeling of problem solving that feels almost miraculous. I think that the challenges are when you start to feel like you're butting up against the limits of your own imagination, and you feel these kinds of dark nights of the soul of like, will I ever nail this? Will it ever come to me? The kind of dread of what if I can't take this story over the finish line? And I think we all have those moments. I mean, listening to Krysty talk about pursuing this story for such a long time with everyone on this call has doggedly pursued this kind of white whale that was just finding clarity and truth in this story. And that comes with some enormous highs and that comes with some incredible lows.
Krysty?
I mean, I completely agree. There is always the sort of dark night of the soul, and it's usually dark and at night. I find there's something really incredible in that. And don't get me wrong, there's like a 45-minute window where I'm usually just weeping in a bathroom. But after that, I'm like, oh, I don't write novels. I write and I have collaborators and I get to phone these people that I love and respect and who are working on this film or who just work in film in general. And I think that to me is the really kind of like lovely thing about screenwriting is you're not trying to write an end product. You're trying to create a blueprint that other people can come into. So I both love and hate the act of working with other people.
David?
That I feel like my job is empathy. Like that is what we do for a living, or if we're doing it sort of at an intentional enough humane level, that's what a joy to be able to sort of think and imagine your way into the psychological and emotional and spiritual lives of people who aren't you, who are nothing like you. And, it dovetails with my other favorite part of this job, which is the research. I love sort of building an understanding of someone else's time period or, sort of professional world or familial relationships. So to me, that's it. I feel like this job makes me a better person because it puts me in the way of better people so often.
And, all of you, writing for the screen, actors are always going to be embodying your words. Do you, more or less write with actors in mind? Do you have always like a dream cast in mind, or do you kind of let that sort itself out in a casting process after the fact, Krysty?
I think I never really, when I pick up the pen, I say pick up the pen, open the laptop. I never actually think right away, unless I've been told by the director, this is who this is for. I know what it's like writing for Andrew Scott, for instance, like you just go, yes. I always feel that there's a past where I'm kind of all the people in the script, which I understand sounds insane. And then, but that's how I kind of link into the empathy of each of them, of their kind of their motivations. And then when I refine it and I start working, it starts coming out with me. I love working with the actors. I love actually like letting them into the script and talking it through with them and changing it, because like I say, like I made it up in my pajamas. Like I can't have got it right. So working with them is such a joy.
David?
I agree with that 100%. And I don't know why there aren't more alliances between writers and actors in our business, because I feel like the work we do is very similar in a way that maybe other people on a set don't have to do it, even the director. But I feel like the conversations I've been able to have with actors are so I mean, useful is the word I was going to say, but it's much more profound than that. I mean, they're so illuminating and they really can change the course of a story. But I tend to, unless there's an actor cast, I tend not to think of actors, because I think that's ultimately going to be unfair to whichever actors are actually cast. I don't want to code someone else's actual nervous system or way of performing into the writing.
Lena?
Well, I've been lucky enough to have some great long-standing relationships with actors where I feel close enough to them that I feel like I can potentially write a first draft and share it with them in mind and share it with them, and they'll understand. Just as I said that, my dog started to scream. So it's really putting your the noises outside your window to shame. I promise he's fine. He just has an attitude about the cat next door. But I will say I've been lucky enough to have that experience, but often I'll think about actors, but they won't necessarily be actors who I think are going to do it. It will be as like absurd as this is Marlon Brando. Like it becomes an archetype for me. And then I think about who is a modern equivalent that might fill that archetype, or I become really surprised on someone who runs completely counter to that archetype, steps in. And then as both David and Krysty have said, the experience of having those conversations with actors and letting them tell me what thing I always say when we're rehearsing is I'm like, tell me if anything feels wrong in your mouth, which sounds slightly wrong in and of itself. But I always say, tell me if something feels wrong in your mouth, because I never want someone saying something that they don't feel that they can deliver honestly, just like I don't want to be writing something that I don't feel like is honest. And so there's really no line I'm so precious about that I can't imagine an actor tromping on it and us replacing it with something else.
Well, I think that for us, like the process is really iterative at Pixar and with animated movies, where you actually have a large part of your time where you're working with scratch performances, because you're just working with like sort of stand-in people. So it's really different, right? Because you just have like people who are not the voice, but just like doing enough so you can, you know, sort of get a sense of it. So early on, you're sort of kind of have no attachment to the voice and the visual acting. And unlike, I think, you know, live action or drama, or theater, where the actor's embodying it with their face and their body, you have actually that kind of acting being taken over by the animators. And so you just have voice. So it's almost like being more like an orchestral, like almost a composer, because you're trying to only isolate it to what you're hearing and who can embody like that, the voice that you want to hear. So for us going into it, I always suspected Sandra would be great at it. I mean, I just knew, but I knew it wasn't my call. And I think that I was really moving forward. So it was Sandra who ended up, you know, being in the movie playing me. And I think that my experience in theater and having worked with her before, then I didn't steer it towards her, but I just knew every time we were working on the script, I knew she can do that. Oh, she can do that. You know, I could just sort of like kind of keep in the back of my head. And then when it finally came to casting, and you know, they loved her and wanted her, like then it was like I could just know that we would be in really good hands. And so we had been working with scratch actors, and then we've been working with Rosalie, who's amazing and is the main character. And she was actually one of our scratch actors who we just brought on in the interim. But then she just grew into the part. And then by the time it came to cast it, we were like, I think it's just her, like, which is so rare. And so then she came in and was wonderful. But then at that point, I was like, we've been working with Rosalie, she's great. And now they're going to have like this fully trained, experienced actor step into it. And I was like, it's going to be fireworks. It's going to be awesome. And it was. So there was a lot of fun with the casting, just because it was like, we got to really just blue sky who we wanted. And then it just worked out just really beautifully.
And the 4 of your films represent, such different genres of storytelling. Is there a genre in particular that you've never gotten to work in that you would love a chance to kind of, try out, whether it's like sci-fi or romantic comedy or Marvel or, something that, would be new to you, Lena?
Well, I've been getting to recently try my hand at a project that exists a little bit more in the fantasy realm, which is not, I read a lot of fantasy books as a kid, but then sort of grew up into the cold, hard light of reality. And so it's been really exciting to have to really try. I feel like when you're writing something that exists outside of the kind of rules and structures of our day-to-day life, you have to get even more focused on plot and structure and character in order to sell this alternate world, which is something that I think that David did so brilliantly in Bones and All, and something that you did so brilliantly in Turning Red as well. And I think that's been a really exciting exercise for me as a writer. And it's not necessarily a genre that I ever sort of dreamed of tapping into, but now that I'm doing it, I can just feel my child self just prickling up with joy.
David?
Because I'm sort of addicted to anxiety, I would love to do a musical, because I don't like going to see musicals. They make me uncomfortable. I get creeped out. So to me, like writing a sincere, earnest musical would shake me so much that I think it would probably do me a load of good.
Julia?
That's such a great question. I guess I hadn't really thought to ask myself. I almost feel like I'm still in a place like, what will they let me do? Like what genre will I be allowed into? And I think if I actually could blue sky, it goes back to something David was talking about, where you're talking about like visual grammars or like genre as grammar. And I think what I love is the idea of bringing my perspective to all the grammars that don't have that perspective yet. So for me, it's about the combination of grammars that is so exciting. Like when you can take, a horror genre and combine it with a coming of age or a medieval, or, it's like those things, the serial killer drama with a different take. It's like, so I think that for me, it's like, I don't know if I could do horror because I find I get scared so easily. So I don't know if I could bear it, but I do think there's something so exciting about taking all these genres that we're so familiar with and then just colliding with them, in a different way. And so I think that to me is what's exciting. And whatever I get to do next, I hope to, just keep finding myself in places I never expected to be.
I mean, I suppose for me, I would love to do like a massive epic, when you see these kind of like, like the 50s Hollywood movies that just ran for like 25 years. And I think not necessarily concentrating on the genre, but just the scale, the size of it. And making 1917 was such a beautiful, collaborative, like incredible process. And I love that I kind of can go out there and I can push projects forward, but I think I probably will never get to do a big, giant, massively, hugely expensive Hollywood epic. So I might as well say that.
Yes, you.
I wouldn't be so sure.
That's happening.
Yeah, never say never. I can very much see that in your future and anyone's future here. I think all of your work is really outstanding, and it was a pleasure to talk to all of you about it and to have all of you talk to each other. As you mentioned,
I think we
writers
should
don't
convene
always
every week. I'm not
Yes.
kidding.
Standing tall.
Like, hi, I'm Krysty and I'm a screenwriter. Just want to
I'll
Just,
join you in
yeah.
that.
just institute a nice new writers salon. That would be really great.
That's exactly right. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. It was such
It's been
a
my pleasure.
Joy.
Good
Lovely to meet you
informative.
all. Lovely to spend time with you. Thank you.